Hello fellow data friends. Would you activate the labor-saving water tube boiler on this tooling workshop? This is Russia in 1947. Water tube boiler would reduce profits for this tooling workshop by £2,000 and Tula has almost 700,000 peasants. Well, I would. Let me explain why. Let's start with the elephant in the room, consumption. Peasants only buy 5% of their needs, while laborers buy everything. You want that consumption. True, but the new coal demand is worth much more. About 90% of laborers of the tooling workshop belongs to this pop. They use £2,000 to satisfy their needs. Since they are only 90% of the laborers, let's say the total consumption of all laborers in the tooling workshop is £2,200. Activating water tube boiler would generate 78 coal, but we have a big company bonus. Let's ignore any throughput bonus, then we need to buy 50 coal. At base price, that is £1,500 of new demands. So we could fire about 70% of our laborers and the total demand in our market would stay the same. It's just spread differently across goods. Still, let's verify. We activate water tube boiler and wait 2 weeks. The remaining pop is now spending £1,210 on their needs. After adjusting for the missing 10%, since they are not all laborers, it's about £1,330. So we lost about £900 in pop consumption, but we gain £1,500 in coal demand at base price, a net increase of £600. But since you have a big company bonus, the tooling workshop is actually using 78 coal, which is £2,340 at base price. So a net increase in demand of £1,440. If a labor-saving production method is creating more demand actually depends on a lot of factors. There's the production method itself. Water tube boiler in a tooling workshop fires 1,500 laborers for 10 coal per level. Mechanized looms fires 1,500 laborers in exchange for 5 tools. Harvesting tools replace 1,000 laborers with 2 tools. The workforce ratio is also important because it influences the amount of dependents and thus consumption. And of course, the standard of living of the laborers. Let's do some calculations to get a feeling when labor-saving production methods induce more demand into the market. Here's a small Excel sheet for some calculations. When we have 1,500 working adults and a workforce ratio of 25%, then we have 4,500 dependents. Dependents consume only 50%, so the whole pop with 1,500 workers consumes like 3,750 working adults. The full buy package for standard of living 10 for 10,000 working adults is £355. This means that the associated pop at standard of living 10 would consume £133. But 10 coal has a total base price of 300, a lot more. We already saw that throughput bonuses increase the demand induced by labor-saving production methods. And if you have a higher workforce ratio, that is lowering the demand lost from the laborers, because there are less dependents which need food as well. But I will stick with the workforce ratio of 25% so we get a lower barrier. And we use 1,000 workers for now, since we need to be able to do some quick estimations while in game. And several labor-saving production methods also use 1,000 workers. So, 1,000 workers at standard of living 10 consume £88. Harvesting tools use 2 tools, which has a base price of 80, so less than the consumption. But after accounting for throughput, 35% in this case, you need 2.7 tools per level, which is 108 base price, so again more. Standard of living 11 uses £392 per 10,000 working adults. That results in £98 of consumption, again less than £108 for tools. But not every farm has 50% black soil and 20% economy of scale bonuses. So activating harvesting tools induces safely more demand, and the laborers have a standard of living of 9 or below. Standard of living 10 it's likely equal. So you don't want to activate labor saving in a farm if your laborers are at standard of living 11 or higher, unless you actually want to save labor. But remember, harvesting tools, and generally labor saving on farms and ranches, have the lowest input goods for labor saving with the exception of steam donkeys in a coal mine. Steam donkeys in a coal mine will never generate more demand that is truly only for labor saving. But what standard of living can we expect for laborers? Let's look at our census data. Okay, we have some freaks above level 20, but they have barely any population. And a lot of gold fields. The first real laborer pop is working in the iron mines in Tula with a standard of living of 17. Steam donkeys would generate 180 pounds in demand in base price and rail transportation 150 pounds in exchange for 1000 laborers. Let's calculate. 1000 laborers at standard of living 17 would consume 172 pounds, which is more than the base price of 5 transportation. But these laborers are probably so rich because of that method throughput bonus, which also applies to any inputs. With throughput, the transportation demand is again higher than the consumption. Let's again look at our census data. We have a lot of laborers in gold fields and manor houses. Okay, here are some laborers at level 14 in normal building. 1000 laborers at standard of living 14 consume about 130 pounds, which should be less than most labor saving input prices. So that would still generate more demand than the consumption lost from fired laborers. Back to the census data. We have some laborers in production buildings at standard of living 13, but most are at standard of living 12 or below. I think that's enough. As a rule of thumb, I would propose: labor saving in farms and ranches will generate more demand through input goods than lost consumption from firing workers if the laborers are at standard of living 10 or lower. For all other labor saving methods, you will generate more demand if your laborers are at standard of living 14. And as long as you have a lot of peasants, you will rarely have laborers above standard of level 14, I think. So you can very likely always activate labor saving production methods not used in farms or ranches, and you will generate more demand. Except steam donkeys in coal mines. Just to clarify, I don't want you to mindlessly activate labor savings at all times. If you activate all labor savings and run into severe shortages or bankrupt a lot of your buildings, that might cause a lot of damage to your economy. You might also argue that you want cheap tools to squeeze out a bit more construction. That is fine. Actually, all playstyles are fine if you enjoy playing them. It's a game. But activating labor savings production methods while still having a lot of peasants is not universally bad. It can be quite advantageous. Just be a bit mindful. Okay, demand-wise, we are totally fine. But what about money? I will use a different save game for that, because it's easier to see in a less developed economy. It works just the same in the big economies, it's just harder to see. This is Russia in 1939. I barely built anything, and I deactivated all construction, so construction will not interfere with prices. Let's have a look at this wheat farm in Kiev. Activating harvesting tools would reduce the profits on the farm by 2,500 pounds, which is bad for the farm, right? But that money is not lost or destroyed, it's spent on tools. Meaning it is just transferred to the tooling workshops, which we can easily verify. On the left is the wheat farm, which makes 4,350 pounds profit. In the middle is a tooling workshop in Kiev, which makes 986 pounds profit. On the right is a tooling workshop from Moscow with 2,750 pounds profit. Let's activate the labor saving production method and wait a bit. The wheat farm is down to 2,000 pounds profit and is slightly using the cash reserve. So the prediction over 2,500 pounds was correct. The tooling workshop in Kiev is now earning 1,000 pounds extra. The tooling workshop in Moscow is getting around 800 pounds extra, which is obviously less than 2,500 pounds, but there are more tooling workshops. So we are indeed transferring the money to other buildings. And here we can also see a case of when you don't necessarily want to activate labor saving production methods early. When you are a junior partner in a market. Say you are Wallachia. Wallachia is in the Ottoman market and still has 300,000 peasants. They actually use harvesting tools. Not using them would increase their profits. But with the harvesting tools, they transfer money to another country because Wallachia is not producing any tools themselves. If they would produce some tools themselves, it would probably depend on the market share. In my initial example, the tooling workshop in Kiev got around 40% of tools profits. Local production and consumption probably helps a lot. But even in this case, 60% of the profits would go to some Ottoman factories. Just to clarify again, I don't want you to mindlessly activate labor savings at all time. If you bankrupt your buildings, that will be bad. But if a building can sustain the lost profit and you need more demand in your market, feel free to activate labor saving. So much about transferring money to other buildings, but which POP types actually profit or suffer? Firstly, where is the money coming from? When we activate labor saving while the building loses money, there are actually two sources. At first, the building saves on paying some wages because we fire some workers. In this case, the building saves about £1,700 in wages. But the tools cost about £3,800. Hence, there's an additional cost of over £2,000, which is subtracted from the building's balance. Hence, the building pays less dividends to the owner. In the case of this wheat farm, it's the manor houses. So we steal money from the aristocrats and also a bit from clergymen. But the building could also be owned by financial districts or companies. In this case, we would steal from capitalists and a bit from shopkeepers. Or the building is state-owned, then some money comes from the state. But who gets the money? Because there are still a lot of peasants, the owner of that building will pocket that money, unless the building is struggling and will hire more workers. Labor-saving production methods usually need tools, coal, transportation, engine, stuff produced by buildings owned by financial districts or the state. So in conclusion, you take money from the laborers, the wages, and the owner of one building and transfer profits to the owner of other buildings. Does this mean you lose money because you cannot tax the fired workers anymore? If you are on land-based taxation, the answer is no. You actually get more money. This is again our starting laborer POP before doing the labor-saving production method. A population of 384,000 pays £356 in income tax. We will come back to the consumption taxes in a minute. This means 1,000 people pay £0.93 in income tax. Let's have a look at this peasant POP. They have 1,000 people and pay 318 land taxes and 17 income taxes. This means they pay £3.35 per 1,000 people. Now let me activate more consumption taxes. Now the laborers pay 966 in total for taxes, which is £2.5 per 1,000 people. That is still less than the peasants are paying. So you actually get more tax money by firing some laborers on land-based taxes. If you are on another tax law than land-based taxes, the laborer will pay you more money. This means on other tax laws you will lose money from the lost laborers. But remember, we are moving the money. If the buildings selling the goods used by the labor-saving production method are state-owned, then you get more government dividends. If they are owned by financial districts, you either might get some dividend taxes or reinvestment into your investment pool. I reload it again. On the left is our investment pool without activating harvesting tools, and on the right is our investment pool with the harvesting tools. You can see a small improvement of about £200. Especially if you are small, you get a nice multiplier for investments into the investment pool. Is that enough to counterbalance the lost income tax on better tax laws? That also depends on your economic system. If the reinvestment rate for capitalists, including the GDP multiplier and the dividend tax together is higher than the income tax, then you actually get more money. Otherwise you don't. My guess is that it is usually more than the income tax. But I'm not sure, and some players prefer money in the treasury over money in the investment pool. Let's talk about the political implications. Initially, I wanted to say that you lose support for whatever interest groups your laborers will support, but at least in 1947, the laborers barely support anyone. According to the game files for laborer, they are 10% to 70% politically engaged, but I don't know how the game handles that. All I can say is that the political engagement should increase with literacy. Peasants are apparently 10% to 50% politically engaged, depending on the literacy. So laborers should be more helpful in dethroning the landowners in the early game, because they are more willing to take action. But I'm currently not convinced that they will have a big impact in the early game whatsoever. Currently, in my game, the political active laborers mostly support the rural folk and the church. At least not the landowners, but not great either. What about literacy and getting higher paid jobs? Let's quickly activate public schools through the console so we can compare peasants and laborers. These standard of living 10 peasants have an education access of 27.5%, 12% from public schools and the rest from their wealth level. And these level 10 laborers have exactly the same education access. So there would be only a difference in literacy because there might be a difference in wealth, right? So let's look at our census data again. We filter by peasants and laborers and sort by standard of living. Now let's eyeball our list. We clearly have a lot more laborers at the top. At around standard of living 10 we also see a lot of peasants. So let's say that the average standard of living of laborers is maybe 4 levels higher. In-game, that would be a difference of 6% education access. And it would be even higher if you have private schools. These are the game files for clerks and machinists. You get qualifications for clerks solely based on literacy, while pops need at least 10% literacy to become machinists. As we saw, even without schools, both laborers and peasants can get qualifications for both jobs. But laborers have an advantage. They get an extra multiplier for both jobs. And if you have serfdom, peasants get a big debuff for qualifications. So activating labor saving production methods early would likely slow down your qualification gain. If your nation struggles a lot with qualifications, it will be less advantageous for you. If you have some kind of schools law and removed serfdom, I think you should be mostly fine though. This should cover almost all arguments regarding using labor saving production methods before you run out of peasants. Did I miss something? Is there a big flaw in my thoughts? I hope not. But if, please leave a comment. And now let's summarize our findings. Most labor-saving production methods introduce more demand in your economy if the laborers in the associated buildings have standard of living 14 or less. It's standard of living 10 for farms and ranches. That is the lower barrier though. It can be higher depending on the production method, the workforce ratio and the throughput of the building. Except steam donkeys in coal mines. Money spent on labor-saving input goods is not lost. Some other buildings will make bank. If you don't produce the input good in a sufficient quantity in your market, someone else will profit though. If you are on land-based taxation, you actually get more taxes because peasants are taxed more. It's less clear with other taxation laws and it's depending on your economic system. If the financial districts get more money, they will reinvest more. And if you tax dividends, you will also get a bigger share on that. If the building is state-owned, you get more state dividends. Politically, there's probably not much changing. Many laborers will be politically unaligned before you get any kind of schools. And you will move money to the owners of non-agricultural buildings, which will be financial districts and the state. I have no idea about the actual impact, but I don't think it's a lot. Just my guess though. Activating labor-saving production methods early will slow down your qualification gain. If you struggle here, you might not want to do it. As a final statement, are labor-saving production methods always good? No. Are they always bad unless you run out of peasants? Also no. Labor-saving production methods can be quite advantageous if you still have a lot of peasants, if you use them correctly. And a big thanks to Solfi for supporting my channel as data capitalist. Very much appreciated. And if you want to know which and how many goods the AI actually produces, click on the top video. Thanks a lot for watching and likely commenting. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. I see you on the next one.